Welcome to Genius or Junk with me, your host, Jim Fowler, where we invite a guest to debate whether an item is doomed to oblivion or it belongs in the genius vault. Only the most deserving innovations will stand the test of time. But do you agree with their choices? In today's episode, a fruity technological marvel and a global device which might be making us stupid. These are the choices of today's guests, Professor Mike Waller, and I'm going to read here because this is long. So, Professor Mike Waller, who's Professor of Design and Innovation and Programme Leader of MA Designing Education at Goldsmiths, University of London. I think the simple way to introduce you would be as a teacher and designer, but I think that just scratches the surface of, your talents really. So why don't you introduce yourself?
That's very kind of you. So my background's in research and development, really. So from a design point of view, I started off as an industrial designer, product designer, and obviously work in education now in the University of London at Goldsmiths. Interestingly, I kind of work inside and outside of the institution. So I do a lot of work with businesses and organisations around building creative kind of innovation culture. So a lot of stuff around prototyping and how to think about where you're going to develop or what you're going to develop in terms of kind of future directions. So I have a very interesting life. I do a lot of work all over the world. We're working in Indonesia and the Philippines and also South Korea. So yeah, I have to say I'm very privileged in terms of my career and how it's developed.
And would you say as well, from what I was speaking to you earlier, you're very much kind of really interested in exploring kind of almost the, interaction between humans and technology and how that comes together and almost more the strategic side of why we need things and what are the problems that maybe some of this technology is looking to solve? Yeah,
so I guess I'm really interested in how we develop kind of more critical understandings of engaging with the things that we do. Obviously humans were social, so all of those things happen within a kind of really complex context. So we have to think much more, I guess, in depth about the impacts and the opportunities of things that we design in many different contexts. So it's all about the kind of, I guess, the underpinning kind of critical practice, we like to sort of say, of how we apply design rather than just solving problems. We like to think of it as kind of setting problems. So what's the broader context? How can we, make these things beneficial to, different types of audiences? So there's some interesting ideas about how do we harness the benefits of innovation? Who should get the benefits?
So, and speaking of, solutions and problems, you're here today to talk about genius or junk items. And I guess the whole human aspect, especially maybe your genius item selection, there's especially from a social point of view, I guess these are almost kind of revolutionary in one sense. So why don't you introduce what's your genius item that you want to see preserved for future generations?
Yeah, so I've picked the Raspberry Pi.
The Raspberry Pi was launched in 2012 by the Raspberry Pi Foundation to make computer science education affordable and accessible. Created by a small team in the UK, the first £35 single-board computer quickly sold out. What began as a classroom tool became a global maker movement, powering everything from DIY robots to industrial systems, with tens of millions of units sold worldwide.
So why the Raspberry Pi?
So I was kind of thinking about how could I also centre the idea of education within the choice that I make. So I picked the Raspberry Pi because it was an object that was developed for people to learn a skill, learn how to prototype and to make stuff with electronics, learn how to program. So obviously I'm very keen on prototyping, so I picked that because it's about building skills. And I guess that kind of leads on to why I picked a particular object for the junk.
So have you got a personal connection with the Raspberry Pi? I'm guessing we're of a certain vintage, and I remember back in the day, the ZX Spectrum and the BBC Micro. And so part of me was, when I was doing a bit of research, I was thinking, God, that just came up so much nostalgia.
Yeah.
And so it seems that the Pi was developed because the people developing it felt there was kind of losing those fundamental computing skills. So is that what appeals to you?
So I guess it's in parallel. So we've had a similar conversation about making in schools around, people saying, we're struggling to get surgeon who can stitch, to fix us in the hospitals. And it's that kind of, how do we have to be really careful how we think about skills and not just skills in the kind of isolated, but the contextual side of skills. So how do we critically engage with the world, and how do we shape the things? How does the world shape us? And there's that kind of relationship. So from the Raspberry Pi is really interesting because, as you said, it has a really fascinating history. But maybe it's more the type of thing. So the idea of kind of microprocessors with the basic stamp, and before that the BBC microcomputer, which is a really interesting piece of innovation in terms of how a government commissioned a company, Acorn. Obviously there were competition like the Sinclair computing kind of gang.
Oh yeah,
very interesting. So the BBC computer became Acorn made it, and obviously then we have ARM, which came out of the kind of RISC machines to make a low-powered kind of microprocessor. So really fascinating kind of history. But then the opportunities of thinking about how almost like hobbyists and how people engaged with making their own devices or thinking about how they might prototype things is really fascinating. So we've also have Arduino in Italy, which comes out of Ivrea and the kind of Olivetti and Italia Telecom, and other kind of microprocessor type things. But they're all got underneath them, they've got this sort of educational engagement, kind of hobbyist kind of mentality underneath them, which I think is really fascinating. And obviously Cambridge University were involved in Raspberry Pi. I think they set up a foundation to get that going, but there was a shortage of people with good programming skills, and they were like, obviously they didn't invent the idea of that kind of thing, but you could see how they were going to use something like that to encourage people to, tinker and play with electronics and stuff. And we also have the maker movement, which is also really fascinating. So being able to fix things, being able to, get your hands dirty, get hold of materials, and not just sit looking at mobile phone screens all the time is something that I guess is quite prescient now. We need to think about how we engage people to have have abilities to do stuff, to change their, their context, their worlds,
do you find
their bedrooms or whatever it might be.
Yeah. and also, do you think it's part of the problem? I mean, one thing I find is that there seems to be the generation who grew up with these sort of I always found the BBC was school. The ZX Spectrum was like for home and stuff. But that generation, so I suppose kind of our generation almost, I found that it's like now when things go wrong, we're a little bit more savvy about, there might be a problem with the hardware issue or the software, and we'll try and explore how to fix it, as opposed to the generation now. I find that they're really kind of, they're really switched on, and they know how everything works, and they're brilliant at kind of, this is how I can build a website in 2 minutes. But if something goes wrong and it can't be fixed with a single press, they're a little bit all at sea. Yeah, they don't even know where to start. Sort of thing. Well, so is that part of the problem, do you think?
Well, I guess we have a huge problem of disposability. People, when something stops working, they chuck it away. We don't fix things. And I think that is starting, people are aware of that now, I think, but it's not changing fast enough. People changing their mobile phones every 2 years, and you think of the amount of resources that go into those objects. They're kind of almost like supercomputers in your pocket. We really need to think more about fixing stuff. We do have kind of screen fixing, but if you go to some other country, India is really fascinating on the fixing front. They're brilliant at, making things last and, tinkering and getting things working. So I think that whole side of, making the best use of the resources that we have, it also does connect this idea of being able to fix stuff or, engage with it. I guess it's like the cars, as maybe getting a bit nostalgic, but as a kid, I'd help my dad with his Land Rover, fixing the gearbox or something. But now, people probably wouldn't attempt to take a gearbox apart on their kitchen floor.
God, sometimes you flip the bonnet just to fill up with the water, and you're looking at it and going, "Oh my God!"
Yeah. I'm not sure I would do that now either. But having done that, it's being, getting your hands dirty is quite interesting. And
have you? Is the Raspberry Pi something you've tinkered with yourself as well?
Yeah, so I've probably used more basic stamps and Arduinos than Raspberry Pi. I use more of the kind of microprocessors to make kind of prototypes. So, sometimes working with organisations around innovation, making prototypes of electronics, often in terms of kind of technology-based kind of prototypes. It's really good for doing things quickly, so testing things out And that's that whole thing, I guess, that I'm really interested in is how do you materialise things? How do we make it? What's the practice around that? How do we make something, well, explore it? So it's not about going straight for the outcome. It's about trying to explore what you could do materially. But that means you need to learn how to, do a little bit of programming and join sensors to things and measure things. So there's lots of amazing things you can measure and, kind of compute if you're interested in that kind of thing.
I was about to say, because I was sort of doing some research and some of the competitions they've held, was it Tim Peake has used Raspberry Pis that have been designed by students, to deploy in the space station, which kind of blows your mind when you think it's something that...
Yeah, what an amazing opportunity, eh?
Yeah, exactly, And also, I didn't realise how phenomenally successful they were.
Yeah.
I think was it 2015 they overtook the ZX Spectrum as Britain's biggest ever selling computer.
Yeah, so I guess their thing's slightly different as well because they wanted to make an affordable computer, sort of Linux type thing. But it's the same kind of, maker culture type thing. They're getting, people to try and think of stuff. But also the flip side of that is there's also a lot of rubbish that's being made, isn't it? So you got to kind of, use it in the right way. But I guess it's a curiosity side, how do we encourage curiosity to do stuff and to be motivated to try stuff out, And
I suppose quite often, we've kind of almost given the solution where maybe it's quite nice to be able to go, right, this is the problem I want to, is there a way I can fix it myself, or even just explore it yourself and get what inspired, I guess.
For me, it's about this whole idea of education really is underneath it. How do we change our kind of circumstances? How do we kind of build a kind of critical engagement with the world? Change things in the way that we want to see them, and participate in that change. It's very easy to be passive, isn't it? And for things to happen to you. So I guess that whole education about, sometimes I think we call it self-actualization. So this idea of, being able to do stuff in the world and actually have a proper dialogue with your life in those contexts is really important. And I see that with some of the companies I work with. So I do a lot of consultancy around supporting organisations developing innovation cultures. And interestingly, a lot of that stuff is all about how you collectively tell the stories and make prototypes and test things out and kind of do innovation as a practice rather than kind of a theory. So sort of that side of it inspires me to see the kind of things like the Raspberry Pi. It kind of encourages that kind of thinking, that mindset.
So with the Raspberry Pi then, have you come across, what are some of the innovations that people have done with it? Do you know some of the solutions or technologies? I mean, I saw that they can, you can even have cameras on there now as well. Yeah. So I'm just amazed. What
I guess. So things like, we're often seeing a lot of these kind of like services for putting CCTV around your home. And you kind of think, well, who's actually being able to look into some of those stuff? There's a lot of hacking going on, a lot of kind of questionable behaviour. So, I've seen some people make their own kind of systems, which I think are quite interesting about, hooking up cameras to their, their Raspberry Pis at home. Tinkering type projects, really.
But also, I mean, I was thinking there, because you're talking about like there's some of the sort of surveillance tools in your house, or if you've got a Ring doorbell or whatever. But I mean, obviously, some of your background is like Internet of Things. Yeah. So is this one of the flip sides of having more connective devices? And I mean, to be honest, for me, it always seems to be, washing machines keep beeping. Everything seems to beep at me and shouts at me to do things. But with Internet of Things, with that connectivity, is that kind of a downside that, it all of a sudden you're being open even more to exploitation?
I completely agree with you. There's a lot of junk around. So I guess it's more in the exploration of stuff. So, some of the kind of monitoring of, weather and kind of information and that kind of stuff is quite interesting. And obviously some of the sensors and the being able to, print things out or, hook them up to your 3D printers and all that kind of stuff. So I guess there's a lot of opportunities to create more and more junk, which is obviously not really what we want to try and encourage. But at the same time, how do we actually make prototypes and test things out and explore them using some of these tools? It's a kind of yes and no answer to that. We do have a kind of too much stuff, too much technology telling us what to do, which drives us all nuts, opposed to thinking about how we able to fix things or change stuff. So there's I guess it's a balancing act, isn't it, between those two kind of ways of thinking about it.
And I guess with the Raspberry Pi, then we can say it's a great example of if we are have more of this stuff, let's try and understand how it all works, maybe.
Yeah.
And so I guess, well, I mean, we love technology, so the Raspberry Pi, there's not really a downside to it, really, is there? I mean, it's a success story all round. So I think that's definitely got to go into the genius vault. I can't see.
Yeah, it's
why
kind of
it?
encouraging people to engage in some of that stuff is really, I think, the positive side of it.
So the Raspberry Pi is definitely going to go into the Genius Vault. And before we move on to your selection for the junk pile of history, let's talk about a bit more about yourself and what the innovations you're up to at the moment. Because obviously, you're as well as teaching, you're researching and combining the two and doing all sorts of things and have patents, and the list is pretty much endless, really. But so what are you working on at the moment, though, that you kind of is getting you excited?
Yeah, so I'm writing a paper at the moment on a project that we've been doing with the British Library around kind of helping businesses innovate in services and products. And what I'm really interested in, or what I'm writing about, is mapping. I know you share a passion for mapping.
Anything visual, yeah.
So very visual in that way.
So actually, let's explain to people what are we talking about with mapping? I mean, obviously, is it we're talking about diagrams, or what are we talking about?
Yeah, well, it's a combination of things, actually. So there's a few different ways of thinking about this. So I guess one of them is about externalizing what you think about a particular context. So in the context of new products and services, what we're trying to do is look at the relationships between what we call things like external forces, so how things are changing. So we're all talking about AI at the moment, that kind of stuff. And other technologies, or particular kind of social trends, or, kind of political cost of living is another kind of big thing. So understanding the relationship of how things change in a more complex kind of context is really important for organisations and how they innovate. So using diagrams and maps helps us externalise our knowledge in organisations. So we build these kind of spatial kind of maps of different types of elements of organisations with those organisations. And then we use those maps to think with. So they're kind of a practice. They're not it's not just about illustrating something or representing it. It's about using these tools as thinking tools. So I'm quite interested in some of the emerging ideas coming out of neuroscience about how I think it's called kind of cognitive scaffolding, how we use the things around us to think with. And obviously design fits very much into that category of, practice, doing stuff, action. It's not a kind of passive thing. So the maps become these almost like catalysts for getting people to all have conversations around the potential of, firstly, the things they've done. So the historical side, like coming from some of the things that you've been involved with in the past, the history is really important to understand where we've been, where we're going, how some of these external forces or the things give us opportunity, but also open up potential kind of questions that we need to ask. So mapping gives us this ability to slow things down so that we can see the relationships. So relational thinking, making prototypes. What kind of prototypes might we make? What kind of stories might we be telling about what we could do in terms of new types of inventions or projects, or how the organisation works? We don't go to work just functionally. It's like, how do we build a culture that we really want to be part of, that has a positive impact socially, rather than it just being a kind of extractive activity.
And so, again, for a visual type person, what would this look like in practicality, though? And I mean, like, I know you say it's not necessarily a map or a diagram per se, but what would it like to explain to a viewer almost, or a listener? How would this sort of manifest? What would we be looking at?
Yeah, so maybe a good example is we did a recent project with the Latvian government, or different people from different departments within government. Fascinating. And we made a 10-metre kind of timeline of kind of the last 10 years and into the future. And one of the things we then did was we drew drawings of different kind of forces that are acting on the country or on the population or local issues, how we get people to participate in kind of change in their communities. And we got pieces of string drawing from those drawings that you can see. What's really interesting is when you're all standing around a big map and you're looking at it on the floor, the drawings you're able to see them much better than you would be able to read everything. So it's really important to have illustrations and drawings on those.
So is it a bit like a CSI, CSI map?
Yeah,
you know,
it's actually very much like that. So, but on the floor, and then we get bits of coloured string and we draw between these external force ideas and into the future. And then we create different types of scenarios to talk about what might happen in the future. What kind of things are important now? What kind of things should we be talking about and starting to maybe do research around? So it's not just about kind of rampant speculation about the future, because obviously we don't really know what's going to happen, but it allows us to kind of focus in on the kind of questions or the research we might want to do in engaging people in these different kind of things. So it's exactly the same in organisations, is if we can stand around a map and look to see how things connect, it gives us the ability to think about those things in different ways. So often people don't look in that way. They don't think about how things join up. So this relational thinking, but very much in an action kind of based thing. So we want to make it productive. We don't just want it to be about a reflective activity. It does need to be a doing thing. So we try and look to then see how the future scenarios or the different ideas, how can we quickly, you're a filmmaker, so you might make you make a film of something like this, yeah? Or you might make a storyboard, or you might take a set of photographs. You draw on the knowledge or the experiences or the tools you have, or you might make a new type of service on a technological product. So it's all about trying things out and opening up those conversations. So if we can have those conversations together, then collectively the culture changes and we start to be much more, I guess, curious, but it's really spotting new opportunities and being responsive and not kind of, what's it called, kind of lead-footed kind of, so get out there and do stuff.
Well, that brings us quite nicely on, I would say, to your device that you've selected for the junk pile history. So far we had the Raspberry Pi, which is all about innovation, learning, and I'm guessing now this next one, which is a little bit, how would we say?
Yeah, because you had this in the kind of genius.
Exactly.
category,
Yeah. So this is controversial. So this is a genius item which you're now chucking on the junk pile of history, but there is a valid reason for this. But so I'm going to turn over my lud to the prosecution for why this should go on the junk pile of history. So what is your junk item?
So my junk item is sat navs.
Sat-nav didn't just help us navigate, it replaced something. In the 1980s and 90s, GPS left the military and entered our dashboards. Suddenly, we stopped memorising routes, reading landscapes, asking strangers for directions. Turn-by-turn convenience slowly outsourced our spatial awareness. Today, most of us can't retrace a journey without a screen. We didn't just gain precision, we traded away our sense of direction.
So the sat-nav, incredibly useful. Amazing piece of technology which has been with us for 20, 30 years really now. So why do you want to chuck this amazing bit of kit, especially from someone who's a designer?
It's a really good question, isn't it? I've picked it because it's a piece of technology that in a way disables us, but not to say that sat navs per se are bad. It's to say that how we create them or how we design them is at the moment in the wrong way. So they kind of disable us from being able to find our way around. And, like you and myself are visual kind of spatial people in terms of how we think. Actually, I need to be able to engage in my environment to know where I'm going.
Do you like a map?
I love a map.
So I like a map too. So is that part of the problem, do you think?
No, but I think it's to do with this thing that when you see people over relying on those kind of technologies, you talk to people about they can't find their way around without them. So this question about enabling, technologies that enable us and technologies that take something away from humans, yeah?
Yeah, so sat-nav's just almost like
it's an example of that.
Yeah.
So I think what I would say is you could design a sat-nav that enhances your skills to find your way. So maybe it talks about kind of features in the landscape, go past the church or go past the park and turn, so it kind of reinforces our spatial understanding of our context. And it's also a screen, it's really distracting us. I find it really hard when I'm driving. If I'm, particularly coming to your studio, trying to find my way using sat nav where I haven't been. If I'm familiar with the place, it's much easier. So maybe it's also to do with my attention kind of, I get kind of cognitive overload, I think it's called. It's like, oh, I don't know where to look, So there's part of that, I think, in terms of we're so bombarded by information that we're kind of disabled by it in a way. And that kind of, for me, is a bit of an issue. There was a really wonderful story by an architect and philosopher called Paul Virilio, and he wrote some amazing books if you're interested in. He's a kind of technological kind of skeptic, but at the same time really interested and focuses on writing about technology. And he was teaching students in architecture this is kind of a few years ago. And one of the things that the architecture students were doing was really over-reliance on 3D visualization of buildings. So he used to make them sit in silence for half an hour, 45 minutes to imagine their buildings rather than going straight to the computer and modelling them. And what he found over doing this over a period of time was that students gained much better spatial knowledge to imagine the buildings that they were going to design. And it's that kind of point. It's like, actually, our brains are amazing. When we talk to kind of cognitive scientists about, neuroscientists about what we're starting to learn about how we learn, how we engage with the world, we start to think, well, actually, maybe we're doing things slightly wrong. So it's about this, how do we get technologies to support human capacity rather than taking stuff away from us all the time. Paul Virilio's kind of illustration's really useful to think about. Maybe we should be doing more of the thinking about, imagining, using our imaginations rather than just, using technology all the time.
I mean, is that part of the problem? Do you think like sat-nav, again, is just an example of the fact that we've created technology that solves problems, but sometimes the journey to solve the problem is that's kind of actually more important than solving the problem, as it were? Because like say, if you visualise are we losing that ability to almost problem solve and use our imagination? Because everything now is just like, that you don't need to think, it's done.
Yeah, I think absolutely we need to be really have our eye on the idea of being critically engaged with the world, and that includes having kind of skills to participate in that. So we've got to be really careful that we don't subtract all that stuff out of our lives. So absolutely, I think it's crucial that we think about that stuff.
And so just so we're not sort of being down on sat-navs, is there any other sort of what's another example, would you say, of that sort of the problem you're talking about? Is there anything else we use that we're a bit like, it's a little bit overkill, or it's de-skilling us?
Well, I guess it's the same arguments emerging with AI, isn't it? It's like you can use it as a tool to enhance things, or you can replace your ability to do things. And it's that kind of balance, isn't it, about how do we harness things to support our abilities rather than taking away from what we can do, our potential. So it's that whole kind of, it's really hard, especially having teenage kind of sons, how distracted they are by many of these kind of technologies, and how those technologies really kind of take something away from their ability to be present. You see them on their screens all the time. It's like, oh, come on, put that down. So I don't want to be a hypocrite about it. We're all addicted, and it's very tempting to look at these things and to be drawn into rabbit holes, whatever it might be. But it's that kind of, how do we balance that stuff out? How do we kind of have a bit more kind of critical nous about it?
Well, yeah, because I think it's a valid point, because I saw a article where they, I think it's true. I mean, again, it was on the internet, so let's hope so. But no, yeah. But it was where they actually did brain scans for people using AI and people not using AI.
Oh, okay.
And they actually found the brain activity was less with AI, which I suppose would make sense, because you're not thinking as strongly, which to be honest, I think it was true, but which I could believe.
Well, it fits with my thesis that I'm trying to put across here about disabling us. So, but I'm not sure. I mean, those brain scans are fascinating, aren't they? We're seeing a lot more of that kind of, understanding how the brain works. So I think definitely being attuned to finding out more about that kind of stuff is really useful for us. I guess coming back to the kind of idea of designing education, which is the masters that I run at Goldsmiths. What's fascinating about that is it's a little bit disruptive. So it's bringing the kind of design approaches and design thinking up against education. So we've got half teachers and half designers in a studio working together on like prototyping and projects, again using this sort of design approach. And they're kind of opening up big questions about, so how do you how do you teach maths? So big questions, that aren't necessarily design questions, but the design of education for maths. So we have maths teachers. We've also got people looking at how you encourage adults to play, which is a really fascinating, and get them to climb trees in the park, in Hyde Park, a fascinating project. The design has a really interesting long history, particularly with architecture as well, around what's called radical pedagogies. So this idea of trying to challenge how we use education to empower people. So I guess a lot of the stuff that's coming out in these choices is to do with empowerment and how we think about how education can really transform us and how we need to be. It's, absolutely important for us to engage in our social kind of context with education and changing ourselves to be the best we can, be, self-actualized or whatever the word is.
So basically, so today we're trying to get everybody to think a little bit harder, work harder and use their brains a bit more. But then...
And support education, I think we've all got, almost we move away from education in our lives. So I really love the idea of lifelong learning, So how can, people with experience get back involved with education rather than feeling like you kind of move further and further away from it? So education should be right at the core of culture rather than seeing it as this, I've got to train kids to behave, in batches, like the kind of Ken Robinson's kind of critique of education. We need to be more creative and we need to enhance our critical thinking skills through practice, making stuff and prototyping, telling stories, making films, making maps.
Right, well, so this which brings me on to the sat-nav. So it's definitely going to stay in the Genius Vault, I'm afraid.
Could we have a caveat?
If you want, go for it.
So my caveat would be, let's, bring some of the kind of neuroscience into sat-nav development where we're talking about learning how to find our way rather than taking away. So I'd like to see the new sat-navs being even more impressive than, if they're going to stay there, to be more impressive.
Okay, well, we'll do that. And I think caveats could be a new feature. So from now on, it's not one or the other. You can have a caveat just to keep everybody happy. But thank you for coming on the show. Two fantastically, brilliantly argued choices, Mike.
And thank you very much for having me. It's been a wonderful opportunity to talk about some of these things.
Well, it's been fascinating to listen to you as well. It's like, I'll be going on. This is brilliant stuff. And tune in again for more Genius or Junk. And it's goodbye from me.
So, another 2 innovations are consigned to their fate. But do you agree? Genius or Junk is an Oski Films production, created by James Fowler and Jamie Loudon. Visit our website, www.oskifilms.co.uk, to find out how we can help you with all your video and podcasting needs.